If you were still in any doubt about the state of the UK rental market, LBC has a good story on its website at the moment. Mother rents out London room for £400 per month, but tenant must babysit children every day and move out on weekends. You can see the advert here. So the room doesn't look particularly fabulous to be paying £400 plus working 3 hours a day as a babysitter from 3 to 6 p.m. on weekdays. And then the advert also asks you ideally to move out on the weekends. Dahlia, would you accept that deal?
I mean, what is so striking about this is that obviously, like, the setup that she's kind of describing isn't new in a certain sense, in that what she's describing would typically be the responsibilities associated with being, a live-in au pair. The difference, of course, is that live-in au pairs are expected to, they get room and board in exchange for, light housework duties. And, I would argue that au pairing itself is quite an exploitative relationship. But the idea when you're an au pair is that you don't pay in order to look after someone's kids. You get free room and board and you get pocket money. And yet here you're seeing almost the reversal of that, which is that you are paying what previously you would have been paid to do. Which kind of shows you quite how upside down and topsy-turvy the entire economy has gone. And I think it's actually quite indicative of something that is more that I'm noticing more broadly. I'm increasingly noticing, particularly in things like, sort of creative industries, from, advertising to theatre to art to music, that previously things that you would have had maybe a paid internship, a kind of entry level work to get your foot into those kinds of industries that you would have, had a paid internship to do, increasingly is becoming something that you have to pay in order to do. That either is unpaid or you have to pay to do courses that help you get a foot into that industry. And that kind of pay to play economy is not just something that is specific to this one advert, but it is kind of a broader trend. And it's so funny to me that it is so counter to what we were always told was going to happen, which was that, free markets and all of this would kind of open up opportunities. And this idea that you can come from nothing and make something of yourself if you work hard enough. It's going in the exact opposite way. It's like it's actually harder and harder to find consistently paid work. And increasingly, you're having to exactly do this, pay to play, in order to participate in, the economy, even as a worker. But I would say, and I'm not going to defend this landlord, but what's interesting about this one incident is that you have kind of two crises coming together and creating this sort of hideous baby. Which is you have this housing crisis, which is that people are increasingly desperate and increasingly willing to accept these extremely exploitative conditions in exchange for housing, and are very vulnerable to this kind of predation. But you also have the childcare crisis, which is that, families with small children are not finding sustainable and affordable solutions to their childcare. And so they're resorting to these, this is way too far, but they're resorting to quite exploitative relationships in order to replace the fact that they don't have access to that proper childcare. So you kind of have this Frankenstein outcome of two crises that are essentially based on the fact that increasingly trying to access the basic things you need, like good housing, like childcare, so that you can go and do whatever it is you're doing, go and work or whatever, that these two things have moved from being essentials to luxuries that very few can afford.
I think that comparison to sort of internships in the media and is a useful one, because people have been saying this for a very long time, and it's absolutely true that you have to be wealthy to get into many industries now, because you might have to work for a while unpaid or on very low pay, and then the only way you can afford to live in the kind of big city that you need to live in to get into that industry, say journalism, is with money from your parents, right? Because you won't have time to both do your unpaid internship and do work on the side and make a success of both, let's say. Now this not only applies to being an au pair, but you have to pay to be an au pair. So either this is going to be some real rich person, or this parent wants this person to go out to work in the morning and come back and look after their kids in the afternoon, all while paying them £400 a month. Very, very strange. Another strange story, well, not strange, this is more outrageous, I should say. According to the BBC, London councils are spending £90 million a month on homeless temporary accommodation. That cost is up 40% compared to last year and poses a bankruptcy risk for local councils. It's a big story at the moment. Many, many local authorities at risk of bankruptcy or have already essentially declared bankruptcy, such as Birmingham. And it's costs such as these, as well as funding cuts, that are really causing that squeeze. Of course, this story also reflects the disastrous state of London's housing market. This is from the BBC again. Since 2010, the number of London households in temporary accommodation has almost doubled, from 36,000 in March 2010 to 63,000 in September 2023. That's according to London Council's latest data. The main causes are thought to be the fast rising cost of living and turbulence in London's private rented sector, alongside the shortage of affordable housing. This is an example of so much that is wrong in politics at the moment in this country, and that's been wrong in policy in this country for a while, right? Which is that you've got this situation which doesn't work for anyone, apart from maybe a few landlords who rent out presumably poor quality temporary accommodation, right? Because this is a disaster for ordinary people who, instead of potentially, these people who are now in temporary accommodation, presumably 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, would have been offered a council home. And they'd have been offered a council home. That council home, the council would have had to have paid for in the first place to build it, but then they would be getting a steady stream of income from that person. Might be paid for by sort of central government housing benefits, but the council would be getting a steady stream of income from that council tenant. What's happened? Well, because of Thatcher, they had to sell off all those council homes. Now they don't have any council homes. They lose that stream of income, but not only do they lose that stream of income, now when people are in housing need, they have to go and pay loads of money to private landlords in temporary accommodation. By the way, I think sometimes they are renting out former council homes. So you have the really ridiculous situation where the council is renting back a house that it sold off 20 years ago on the cheap and is now paying an extortionate amount every month to a private landlord for a not very good service. Loads and loads of families living in temporary accommodation, very difficult to make plans into the future because you don't know how long you're going to be there. So it's incredibly expensive for the state, very, very unsatisfactory for ordinary people who are using the service, in this case, housing. And the only people that benefit are essentially a fairly parasitic group in society, landlords, right? And in this case, the kind of landlords that rent out loads of temporary accommodation, which I don't think is going to be the most, let's say, well-meaning part of that sector, which is already problematic to begin with.